Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Someone was asking me the other day in an interview, did I think we could ever solve this thing? And I said, well, there were probably people sitting in the pre-Civil War times sitting there saying, well, we'll never solve this. It's impossible. And we go to war over it. And yet, today, we do have general agreement on the divisive issue of that time.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Father Robert Kirtland, a priest from St. Clement's Parish in Toledo, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections is the abortion debate, avoiding slogans. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Well, Bob, I'd like to talk a little bit about the recent Supreme Court decision, often known as the Webster case these days, and to see what some of the ramifications of that are. Perhaps we should look at a little bit of that background that's connected with all of that. We go back to the Roe v. Wade case, Supreme Court decision of January 22nd, 1973. That was a 7-2 decision, by the way, a wider margin than we had in the recent case. And it really decided on the basis of the right to privacy, which was founded in the 14th Amendment, that says that a woman had the right to terminate a pregnancy. And that's the law of the land, what we've been living with, and now we've got this Webster case. Why don't we just go back to Roe v. Wade for a minute and see if there's anything else we want to say about that by way of background. Do you want to comment on that?
The Roe v. Wade was simply an extension, as you say, of that rather nebulous concept of a penumbra of privacy that was caught up in the guarantees of freedom in the Constitution and passed on then to the states and to all governmental authorities, not just the federal government, through the 14th Amendment. But it's a concept that the court discovered only really in recent years in a variety of applications. It was one that was very much opposed by the great Justice Frankfurter for many years. It came into prominence with the Griswold case many years before that, which had struck down a Connecticut law limiting access to birth control information and materials. And it was done on the idea that the government had no business constructively getting into people's bedrooms and so on. Well, this was a natural extension enough of the idea of privacy. I think it's also apparent that the court at that time was very libertarian. The court at the time of Roe v. Wade was very libertarian, and there wasn't much of a conservative voice. I also think it's apparent that not only because of the decision itself, which is perhaps not the most clearly reasoned statement of the court in modern times, but also because of subsequent statements that that Justice Blackmun, who wrote the decision of the court in that abortion case, he very much believes in abortion as a value that he believes should be guaranteed to women, and so that he was finding a means to enshrine that deep conviction of his in American constitutional law through the
He's the one that wrote the majority position.
That's right. Yeah, yes. He wrote the decision of the court.
Yes, right.
That's right.
So that gives us a little bit of background. So that 14th Amendment what we were talking about is the one that said the states had the obligation not to take life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Now that doesn't say anything about this right to privacy, but I take it that they built their argument out of that, what the 14th Amendment had to say.
That's right. The 14th Amendment is just a channel by which really the provisions of the Bill of Rights generally have come to be applied to the individual states. In the original concept, the Bill of Rights applied only to the federal action, and the 14th Amendment was taken as a conduit by which to impose upon the states the same obligations that the federal government had with regard to the rights of individual citizens, and so that it comes into that business of freedom from unreasonable search and seizure kind of thing.
And so it boiled down to saying that women had a right, as the common saying is, sort of over their own bodies, or to deal with their own personhood in this way, and so that it was extended to say that the states could not restrict that right.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, what it said was not that women had this right. That was the implication, because what it said was that the state may not interfere with the exercise of this.
That's the main point, that the states could not do that. And
that's
therefore the implication is, and the common catchphrase has been, women have a right over their own bodies.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so that gives us some sense of Roe v. Wade and what we were dealing with. And now we have the recent decision, the becoming known as the Webster case, much longer title.
Yeah, presumably it'll be Webster, yeah.
Yes, So now let's take a look at what that has done. It really was dealing with a law in the state of Missouri, right?
That's right. Or a law with a number of restrictions on the use of public funds and public institutions, hospitals supported by public funds and so on, to give counseling with regard to abortion, to encourage it, or to perform abortions. And once again, it was directed at state action, and it did indeed reverse a trend that the court had been following until now, which was to strike down any state limitations at all upon abortion that seemed to violate the rather narrow reading of the strictures in Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade said that the state could not interfere with the decision to have an abortion during the first trimester. It could lay down some considerations for the health and welfare of the mother in the second trimester, and in the third it could limit the access to abortion very severely if, in the judgment of the state legislature, that was important for the life of the mother.
One thing that's happened now is that the trimester idea is not built into the Webster case.
That's right. It's thrown out now.
Right.
And of course that was a good thing, because to talk about viability is a moving point. One of the aspects of viability, as I understand what the doctors are saying, is that is in part at least a statement of the state of the art at any given time, and the ability of medical institutions, healthcare institutions, to preserve the health and life of a newborn infant. And certainly that thing has over the years been pushed back, probably as far, I guess, from what the physiologists say, as it now can be. Although I think that some of the people who are doing research in this area talk of the idea of the possibility of a totally artificial womb. I don't know at all, and that's something the scientists have to answer.
I heard some of the doctors saying that they thought that the current Webster case was really not in touch with current medical practice, and even said that it contained some foolishness. I think it was in relationship to the age of viability and the lung capacity of the fetus.
Yeah.
And they were talking about 20 weeks or so, and the way I understood, the doctors were saying, well, they didn't see how that was possible according to the current practices.
Well,
current understanding of the viability of the fetus.
I think there are many doctors who don't like anybody who's not a doctor looking over their shoulders. I mean, they're unusual in that most of us enjoy having people looking at us from outside and criticizing what we do, but doctors are an exception to that rule.
Yeah, we're going to list priests,
that's
right?
That's right.
Bob,
Priests
we're really open to criticism, right?
And of course, you'd like to have somebody come into your class when you're teaching and suggest how you should and shouldn't be doing this. Yeah, but I think that I think that those statements are exaggerated, as I understand it, and I haven't read the decision. It, of course, just came out Monday, and I haven't seen the advanced sheets on it yet. But I think that it left the decision of a child who was at least 20 weeks gestation, or a fetus of at least 20 weeks gestation. They left it to the discretion of the physician, and that if, in the physician's judgment, there was a prospect that the child would be born viable, that he was to do the testing, but it was his judgment, as I understand it. Now, once again, we have to look at what the court says. But the court isn't telling doctors exactly how to practice medicine. I think the point behind that, in the state legislation, which the court was reviewing for constitutionality, the idea might very well have been instead to insist that the doctor must regard the fetus as a patient as well as the mother.
And that really is a change, isn't it? I mean, from the kind of viewpoint. Well, there is something in Roe v. Wade, though, isn't there, that the states do have an interest in potential human life, I think is the phrase that they use. The state has a legitimate interest in that. I recall that phrase probably in one of the opinions written.
Yeah, as I recall, that I think was something that had to do with that third trimester limitation of access to abortion.
Would lead to that, of saying yes, the states could regulate during the third trimester.
That's right. That's right.
Well, Bob, what's going to happen with all of this now is that we're going to get this moved to the state level, aren't we? I mean, this is the various states now are going to be considering legislation. People are going to be introducing legislation from both sides of this debate, and some will be trying to restrict the availability of abortions within the state, and we're going to get a battle within the state legislatures. We're going to get a battle over the election of state legislators in the future. And I would say one potentially good thing about all of that is that the debate can get carried on. In other words, we're going to be forced to look at it again. We can't just sit back and say, well, the Supreme Court has said this or that, but it will promote more discussion at a local level. Now, probably a lot of that is going to be heated discussion, and we're going to get a lot of polarized debate. But at least somewhere in the midst of all this, there has to be some potential to get some honest and open discussion going on this most difficult and trying question here.
Oh, I think that's perfectly true. As a matter of fact, I think that's a very real value. You have to remember, of course, that it was the Supreme Court that took it out of the political forum and out of state political debate, 16 years ago.
That's right. You know, I was thinking of Judge Bork, who's been on television a lot lately because he almost was on the Supreme Court or was up for it, and he gets interviewed all the time. And I notice he has a theme that comes out over and over, that we got to return the court to being a legal institution and not a political institution.
Or an instrument of social agency,
No. That seems to be a major point. He said that he would have been on Justice Scalia's side. Out of all the opinions that were given, he said it was Scalia's that he would be most in tune with. And the way I took it was Scalia had said that the court really should have just gone right straight forward and overturned Roe v. Wade.
That's right, yeah, and that's an interesting thing. But getting back to your point about the public debate about it, since the court preempted the political process in Roe versus Wade, the debate has been academic, and therefore we haven't had debate nearly so much as simply the tiresome and repeated reiteration of extreme positions from one end of the spectrum and the other, and that's hardly been a debate. So that, as you say, the fact that this is tossed back into the political arena means, I think, that we have the opportunity for a serious debate, so that citizens who now are going to have some voice in what kind of decision is going to result will have to and have the opportunity to do some thinking and to listen to some thinking about the thing, which was a waste of the average citizen's time before, because if the court was going to take the decision over, the average citizen didn't have anything to say about it.
That's really a good point. It really set a mood, didn't it, in the country? And the other thing it did then, I suppose, that it let something simmer for 16 years, and now we're going to see it bursting out all over the place.
Oh, yeah, and it's an excruciating issue, as we know.
Let's get that out front. I mean, you know, it is the most divisive issue we've had for probably in memory since Prohibition debate, and maybe even having to go back to the slavery question.
Yes.
I know someone was asking me the other day in an interview, did I think we could ever solve this thing? And I said, well, there were probably people sitting in the pre-Civil War times sitting there saying, well, you know, we'll never solve this. It's impossible. And we go to war over it. And yet, today, we do have general agreement on the divisive issue of that time.
That's right.
And so it gives you a sort of larger historical perspective to say, yeah, a lot of times you can make surprising progress. There were people who said that issue could never possibly be solved, and yet today the issue of slavery is a non-issue in the United States.
And then, of course, the obvious parallel is that Justice Taney decided when the Dred Scott case came along that the Supreme Court could solve the problem, the debate for the nation on slavery, because the court's original position from the the Conference of the Judges was that they would simply refuse to hear the case. They would refer back to an earlier case, Strawder versus Graham, in which the issue was precisely the same as in Dred Scott. But Taney, the poor man, thought that he could write an opinion that would clarify the issue and settle the debate for the nation on the slavery issue. And it's another one of those instances where the court's taking on an issue that was not ripe for resolution was making a terrible mistake. The only thing that's scary about that is to remember that the consequence of that debate was the Civil War.
Yes.
And that's pretty frightening. But getting back to this thing...
We're probably not going to have a Civil War, but we are going to have a very inflammatory debate going on.
Well, we're getting a lot of violence, and I think that is one of the most discouraging things about it. But one of the oddities in Justice Blackmun's dissent in the Webster case that's just come down is that he says now the door is open to violent political debate, precisely the thing we're talking about. And an editorial in the Wall Street Journal this morning said it's too bad he didn't think of that in 1973, because he was the one that set off the polarizing falling out of the two sides on an issue which was not ripe for resolution.
So, Bob, what we're going to have to do now, or what we need to push for, it seems to me, is some sort of rational debate on the question. And
Yes.
There's been a man, Father Richard McCormick, Jesuit theologian, who has his own bias, as everyone does on this question, has written an article in which he talked about 10 rules for debating the question. And we might just look at some of those
Sure.
and discuss them a bit about how they're going to help. And I noticed that one of those that he uses is you've already referred to, and that is avoid the use of slogans, because the slogans just get in the way. And he gives very definite examples of all of this. He says, first of all, the pro-life people should not walk around describing abortion as murder. He says that's an inflammatory slogan, and that it's a value-laden term, he says. That means a morally unjustifiable killing of another person. And he claims that it's not necessary to defend the rights of the fetus or what he considers the Catholic position by the use of that language. So he thinks that we don't get any place that way. Now, if you listen on television and you see the sloganeering and you hear that a lot, and that's on a lot of the placards that's used. Now, there might be a debatable kind of point, but McCormick's suggesting that we not use that word murder to describe what is happening to the fetus.
Yeah, I think that's important. In fact, that brings up one more thing about the court I'd like to talk about a bit before we get into that, and that is that murder is a crime, and a crime is an artificial quantum. A crime is an act committed in violation of a statute. And so that's why we have a trial of somebody who's obviously shot his next-door neighbor. We've seen it happen on television. We know that A shoots B, but we still say he's a suspect and he's not guilty until a trial establishes that. So the crime is an artificial quantum, and a murder is a crime. And therefore, precisely as the court came along and said that there was nothing wrong with abortion, then it took away the notion of crime and of murder from the idea of abortion. And that just leads me to say that I'm not sure that the court itself has been entirely clear in pointing out that there are legal questions and ethical questions here, and we live in a time when, unfortunately, the court sets a current going that something is ethically okay if it says it's legally okay. We've tended to equate those two things, and I think that's one of the most pernicious kinds of mistakes that could flow out of this whole thing. That's one of the things that I think was kind of bad about Roe versus Wade. It kind of made all kinds of people say, I would never have an abortion, I would never approve of having an abortion personally, but it's okay for somebody else to do it.
Yeah, that is also one of McCormick's principles. He says we must distinguish morality and public policy. That you cannot simply equate those two. Now, sometimes they can go together. I mean, a moral position can be enshrined in some sort of public policy,
like not beating up little kids or spouses or things like that.
But there's also times when there's a differentiation between the two.
Oh,
and
yes.
One has to be aware of that.
And it's tremendously important to keep those things apart in both directions, both that law not be corrupted into becoming an instrument of moral convictions on the one hand, because the business of law and the business of government is not totalitarian. It doesn't cover the whole span of life. It covers a narrow but important segment of the life of a society, which is to say the public order.
So it can get as simple as this. If something is allowed legally, then people say then it must be morally all right to do.
It must be okay without drawing that distinction. That's right.
It must be morally okay. I mean, that's sort of the conclusion. And that really is a false sort of identification, and I think it needs to be cut through, and we have to make a distinction.
It can only muddy our thinking about law and ethics and morality if we allow it to go unnoticed.
Let's go back to another slogan here, Bob, that McCormick says that we should beware of, and that is the phrase, a woman has a right to her own body.
Yes.
This simply assumes that the fetus is part of the woman's body, which, is not a total statement, I don't think, about fetal life. And it sort of makes the implication that a woman rights over her own body are absolute in some sense. I mean, what that factors out from a religious viewpoint is God and how we relate to God, and that God is the author of life, and that there's some sort of respect, that fundamental respect is due there. But he sees that as another slogan that really doesn't get us any place.
It doesn't move the debate along in any clear fashion. All that's right. The difficulty with that, and the people who tried to draw all kinds of parallels, is the fact that pregnancy is an absolutely unique human phenomenon. I mean, we don't have anything that is exactly the parallel. Being in the same rocket ship or the same lifeboat or whatever is not precisely the same thing, and so that for the notion that the fetus is simply a part of the woman's body, it's an appendage like a wart or something of that sort that one may choose to excise, certainly does not clarify why the whole issue of abortion is so painful.
Right. So one of the first things, if we're going to carry on a rational debate, now that this is moving back to states, we ought to try to avoid the slogans on one side of saying, talking about murderers and murder, and the other side just simply saying a woman has a right to her own body.
Eric Voegelin always used to say that slogans were intellectual terrorism, that you would be making a point and somebody would come along and say in very absolute tones, a woman has a right to her own body, or abortion is murder, and it was supposed to intimidate you into shutting up.
Yes, well, that's a good point to keep in mind. Now let's take up a second one here that McCormick says about these rules for debate, if we're going to do this better. He talks about...
I'll let you get through those rules, Jim.
Well, we're not going to get through all of them, Bob. We don't need to, but they are helpful, I think, to get us what we're after here is how we're going to deal with this question now in such a troubled issue. Another one he says is attempt to identify areas of agreement instead of just starting out what we don't agree on. So, and he makes some stabs at that. He says we could all say that abortion in most cases is tragic and an undesirable thing. I mean, as simple as that abortion is tragic. I noticed there was a news program the other night, and that was sort of a tagline, that people disagreed, but the one thing they seemed to agree on was that abortion is a tragic thing, and usually undesirable. I think that's important to realize here, for pro-life people to realize, I think, that the other side isn't simply saying, whoopee, let's have more abortions.
Yeah, I'm going to get pregnant so I can have an abortion.
Yeah,
it's
we got to see it.
Do.
Yeah, it's not a happy event. It's an undesirable thing. There's a tragedy about it, and of course I think you ought to get that said early on. And I can tell what happens is on the side of the pro-choice movement, I mean, they don't want to say that because it seems in one way to weaken their position. Same way the pro-life people very often have to be careful of things. They won't concede certain elements because it's going to weaken the position.
That's
we
right.
can't. An argument like that is never going to get us anyplace. So
one
let's
wants
start
the
out.
intellectual honesty to recognize those things which tend to diminish one's own, look as though they're going to diminish one's own position.
Here's the second thing he says that we ought to try to agree on. So he says that all should support better sex education, try to reduce poverty, which causes a lot of the problems, support practical alternatives to abortion. And again, here's where the pro-choice people could get after some of the pro-life people and saying, well, you talk about this, but where are you in trying to deal with the problem in other ways? Where are you in getting alternatives? And I think it's Brian Hare who says that there is a tremendous moral responsibility that's taken up by any pro-life people. That is, responsibility to say, how are we going to make these alternatives viable? What are we going to do about making life easier for unmarried pregnant women? What are we going to do about the children brought into the world? And I think that really is. I mean, there is a terrible moral responsibility taken on if we're going to adopt that position.
Oh, that's right. And part of the irony of that, I think, is that abortion becomes formally recognized and legal in this country, the most prosperous nation that the world has ever known, at the time of nearly our greatest prosperity. Should be the time when all of a sudden we say we can't afford children, unwanted children, with the word unwanted in quotes. And there's a real irony to that. We're just not doing the kind of address to these problems that lead people to seek abortions that we could and should do. And I think that it is very clearly incumbent on the pro-life people to take a far more forceful position than many of them seem to have taken.
This comes down to a very personal level, doesn't it, Bob? I mean, I know in dealing with young women who are faced with that decision that they have to be able to see that there's a viable alternative.
By all means.
They have to see it's got to be live. It's got to be possible. You can't be an abstract thing like, well, yeah, you could bring the baby to term and then adopt the baby out. It's got to have a note of possibility about it. They've got to see how they could fit yet into their community, how they would be accepted in their family, how the church would treat them during this time. Unmarried pregnant woman, would the church be kind to them and have a place for them?
And not
so
just the
they
church,
have to be able
but
to see that. Well, not just the church, society,
but society
as a
at
whole,
large.
yeah.
I mean, it has to be a context in which people have
the point I was
a
trying to
profound
make
sympathy.
is it would have to be the real life communities where you live,
That's
at
right.
work, in your family, in your church, that where you could see yourself actually living this out and not being the object of scorn or being somehow totally ostracized by your friends or communities and so on.
Yeah, one may very well have thoughtlessly gotten pregnant in circumstances where she should not have done so by moral standards, let us say. But the pregnancy, the fact of the pregnancy, is described by many people as being one of the great, profoundly creative experiences of life, and it should be a time of great challenge and great happiness in the sense of fulfillment. And to rob the pregnant young woman of that is, I think, one of the great tragedies of this whole social context in which we regard the business.
So what we ought to be able to do is get some sense of agreement on this, that there are large social context here that we have to be worried about, and a lot of it has to do with poverty, and we know that. I mean, that's a factor in the whole thing.
But a large part of that context, too, is the responsibility of the church to develop in the minds and hearts of people. It's the way you speak of the church, and as an institution, I think that we have certainly the responsibility to be concerned about the development of resources to help people meet this challenge. But by the same token, the church wouldn't have to be going around making the argument against Roe versus Wade if the Christian churches generally had been more successful in inculcating a sense of the sanctity of life.
Yeah, general sense of
the
uniqueness of an individual, that we're made in the image and likeness of God, and that all life, and I mean, I think that becomes the most important way, life at all stages of its development. That's the idea, I think, that really has to be brought forward here.
Yes.
And that includes the elderly, that includes the handicapped, and so on.
Oh, sure, you think of the retired people who, in the context of our thinking today, feel useless. They've been put on a shelf because they're no longer productive, as though the value of the human person were a factor of one's productivity.
Right. That's a terrible thing in our society, no doubt about it.
Yes.
Well, Bob, we've been talking here about the Webster decision of the Supreme Court, which has opened the door to a new debate. One of the things we see as a result of the Webster decision is that people are going to be taking this to the state legislatures. There's going to be a debate going on in each of the 50 states, and there's going to be election questions at hand and so on, and are people pro-life or pro-choice? And what we're hoping is that it's going to lead not just to fireworks, but to some enlightened debate, so that people can begin to talk about this. And if we're going to talk about it effectively, we need to avoid slogans like thinking of abortion simply as murder, or a woman has a right to her own body. And we're going to have to identify some of these areas of agreement, like taking care of the social context. It's a fascinating question that's going to be with us a long time.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talked with Father Robert Kirchner, a priest from St. Clement's Parish in Toledo, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections was the abortion debate, avoiding slogans. If you have any comments on this week's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo. Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
The idea is, I guess, that the court is opening the door here to other states drawing up restrictive laws, and those eventually would probably go to the Supreme Court as well.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Father Robert Kirchner, a priest from St. Clement's Parish in Toledo, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections is the abortion debate, identifying the core issues. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Well, Bob, I'd like to talk a little bit about a recent Supreme Court decision. It's the case of Missouri Attorney General William Webster versus Reproductive Health Services, a St. Louis abortion clinic. And I suppose that it will be known as the Webster decision. And I want to talk a little bit about that and the ramifications of that decision. It's probably good for us to get that into some sort of context about what it's all about. I noticed that in that Missouri law there's a preamble that talked about life beginning at conception. And I think that the general sense of that is that preamble is not a law, and that the Supreme Court this time was not really making a statement about when they thought life began, although they did sort of reject the trimester approach used by the court in Roe v. Wade. You want to comment on any of that at all?
Not particularly. I mean, I think that the only function of a preamble as a general rule, and it can vary from state to state, is that a preamble to a statute is not part of the law, and that it simply may afford some indication of the mind of the legislature, the legislative intent in the statute that follows. But insofar as it is then essentially a rhetorical statement, it would hardly be the kind of thing the court would address, and it's hardly the kind of thing from which anybody could draw any conclusions that would be binding on individual persons as such.
That debate will continue on about when human life begins. I notice a lot of the moralists are moving away from any talk about personhood, that the word person is such a sliding term that they often feel it just muddies the waters here. And that I notice they more often speak about nascent human life or potential human life when they begin to try to talk about what fetal life is all about. But the language of personhood does seem to get in the way, because when we talk about person, we're usually meaning someone with ability to communicate, one who is able to love, and so on. At least in the popular mind, I think that's how it comes across, and that's how the word seems to function. So I think a lot of the moralists move to a more neutral kind of language, which would be potential human life.
Yeah, I'm not sure I like that movement away from the use of personhood, because obviously the difficulty with regard to that thing is that you have a continuum of life that begins at the time of conception, or at least nidation, and goes on, if it's in favorable circumstances and undisturbed, all the way through what we recognize clearly as human life to death. And it may be 80 or 90 years later, and that at some point in that continuum we would very much object to the denial of the use of the word person. And we do think of the personhood of the newborn infant, which is about as expressive as that of the unborn child, and so that I don't. That's not something I feel very sympathetic with.
Mm-hmm. The other part of this, of the Missouri law, and that's what a Supreme Court does, right? They're looking at state laws and they're trying to see if they believe that they're constitutional or not.
Yeah, if they violate rights that guaranteed in the questions of constitutional review, they're looking to see if the state laws infringe some constitutional right.
Right, that's their function. Now, what the state law of Missouri said is something like this, that physicians must use medical tests to determine viability of fetus, that is, whether the fetus can live outside the womb or not. Whenever a woman who appears to be 20 weeks pregnant requests an abortion, and it seems as though the court has generally upheld this as being constitutional, that the tests are a reasonable way of advancing the state's interest in protecting potential human life.
I would think that the court might be saying that the state may, if it wishes, require physicians to do that. I haven't seen the decision yet. It was my understanding that the court left the decision to make those tests to the discretion of the physician, but I'm not sure.
The physician would have to end up making that judgment.
Whether or not the test was called for, yes.
Yes. That's the impression I get in reading the news reports, too. And then the other part of the whole Missouri law that they were dealing with said the state funds employees in hospitals may not be used to provide abortions or encourage or counsel women to have abortions. Now, that's state funds may not be used. Now, I think we're talking about public institutions, in other words. So
That's right.
the Missouri law is very restricted. It's not saying anything about what could happen in private hospitals and so on.
That's right.
Or even abortion clinics that have no state funding. So it's very restricted, but the idea is, I guess, that the court is opening the door here to other states drawing up restrictive laws, and those eventually would probably go to the Supreme Court as well.
Yes, I rather imagine they would.
In other words, you say that as sort of with a weary look, that you think that this is going to happen, and we're going to continue getting cases like this. They already took on cases.
Yeah, well, there were a lot of ramifications of Roe versus Wade, and as a matter of fact, I don't think there's been a term of the court where some aspect or other of the whole large abortion issue has not been on the court's docket.
Bob, what is going to happen now is we're going to get this debate carried on, I think, in the state legislatures, and hopefully that the ordinary citizen is going to be in on the debate and to try to do it intelligently and rationally and without just using slogans and so on. And one of the things I'm borrowing here from Father Richard McCormick's what he called 10 rules for debate about abortion. And I want to just run a couple of these by you and see what sort of reactions they promote. One, he says, make sure you represent the other person's position fairly. Mm-hmm. Now, that's something that we always try to do in debate. And so that one of his points in exemplifying this, he says, don't say that a woman who hasn't had an abortion necessarily has no respect for nascent life. Because, in other words, be fair about it. Because you and I know, in dealing with women who are in this situation, in pastoral situations, that they very often are just torn, and it's a very difficult thing for them to manage. They're often not thinking clearly. There's all kind of pressures upon them and so on. And so I think just to say that any woman who's had an abortion, and there are large numbers in our society, simply have no respect for incipient human life, it really is not fair. I mean, we know that. And so that would be one example of where we would perhaps fail to represent the other positions fairly.
Yes, it seems to me that nobody can really espouse a pro-life position very well unless he or she does understand, in fact, why people do have abortions, why they feel driven to it. And that excludes the abortions that are done as a matter of convenience, which I think is something that most people would repudiate. But where you get a person who, because of a social situation, economic situation, the fear of bringing a severely deformed child to birth, things of that sort, cases where very often, were it not for the skill of modern obstetrics and gynecology, the child would be aborted naturally before term anyhow, and isn't now because of the quality of care. You take all of those things, the person who's in favor of pro-life has to understand why that woman feels compelled to have an abortion.
Right, and very often that seems to be missing in the debate. I think what people often don't like about that really radical position is that they don't feel an empathy for the women who are in this situation. And I think the pro-life movement will be far more effective when they demonstrate that kind of empathy, and not just an empathy for the woman, but an understanding of the social situation, which often produces this need or felt need for an abortion.
Sure, and on the other hand, I think it is equally important for the pro-choice people to understand what in heaven's name the pro-life people are upset about. I mean, to understand fully the foundations of that position, the respect for life, at least for nascent life in the womb, which explains why the pro-life people are so intensely committed to their cause.
That's, again, what McCormick makes the point, that it really is not fair to say that pro-life people are simply involved in what he calls a total preoccupation with the status of the unborn. That we have in the Catholic community a talk about the consistent ethic of life, in which our leaders, at least, are very insistent on the idea that we in the Catholic community want to promote life at all stages of development, and that leads them to a position to be against capital punishment, for example, and has led them to write their pastoral letters on the economy and on peace. that consistent ethic of life they want to see applied across the board. And therefore, I think it would be, again, unfair on the side of the pro-choice people to say, well, the pro-lifers are just interested in fetuses and nothing else.
Even at the expense of the life or the convenience of the mother,
right,
or the health.
Well, that has always been a false kind of charge.
Sure.
I mean, leveled against Catholic pro-life people. That has never been the case. The example of the ectopic pregnancy or of the cancerous womb has always been an exemplification of that. There really is a general feeling. In fact, I heard it repeated on Nightline, and Ted Koppel himself said it, and there's few more knowledgeable people around, and he really did say something like that one night about, well, the Catholic position must favor the fetal life over the life of the mother. And that really has never been the Catholic position, and it's really unfair to characterize it that way. And the example I always use is that we've always had that idea, if a pregnant woman has a cancerous womb and it's diagnosed as such, that it is a legitimate, good, morally proper thing to do to have a hysterectomy, even though indirectly the fetus is going to be aborted and the nascent life is going to be killed. And we've always said that, and that's been part of our general practice. So the pure blanket statement that we favored fetal life over the life of the mother just isn't true.
No, but at the same time, I've known lots of Catholics who thought that was the position that the Catholic Church was taking.
Yes, that's
and
true.
I can remember years of teaching nursing students and finding out that whole classes of nursing students would believe firmly that the life of the child was to be preferred to the life of the mother. They didn't agree with it necessarily, but the point is they thought that was what the Catholic position was.
Yeah, so we try to overcome that now and try to make that clearer. I think that many of the Catholic moralists are in a position of saying what you've got very often are conflicting values. And the hard thing is to figure out how to balance those and to work your way through those conflicting rights and values.
Or to work out things in such a way as to show respect for both of the values that are in conflict, the life of the mother, the life of the child, both in danger, and in the measure possible you try to find a solution that is going to respect and preserve both of those values, and to accept only with a sense of profound failure and tragedy when you are not able to preserve both values.
That gets back to one of those things that we would like to see held up as common ground, that abortions are in most cases tragic, that they are undesirable, and that one ought to feel some of the tragedy of that and not just speak about it as though it were evacuating the womb or an act that has no consequences.
That's right. Abortion is always killing, and killing is an awful, violent sort of thing no matter what circumstances it happens in.
Here, let me try another one here to keep this debate civil and to try to help us to work this out in the years ahead. McCormick suggests that we distinguish the pairs right and wrong from good and bad. And so he says the discussion about abortion is about its objective moral rightness or wrongness. And it's not really about the personal, private good or bad intention of those who have had abortions. And I think, again, that he says this allows us to argue without implying evil motives in the other. And so he wants to use the words right and wrong as more objective statements about the situation, arguing about abortion, is it a right or wrong thing to do? Whereas you get into good and bad, you are imputing sort of personal motivation to people. Of course, in the Catholic community, again, we have to make that clear that the Catholic Church does not go around saying that individuals have committed mortal sins. What the Catholic community sometimes says is that this is a serious matter, and this is a grave matter that one has to take with extreme seriousness. It is a very different thing from saying you committed a mortal sin, which is a judgment reserved to God alone and can't be made by any church person of any rank. So that distinction, I think, really is helpful, and it's helpful just in general to avoid what the gospel enjoins upon us, to avoid sort of rash judgment, and judge not because then we would end up being judged. Judgment about moral culpability is finally in God's hands, and to the best of our own ability to judge our own conscience in relationship to the moral law. So I think that would, I mean, we're in there, right? I mean, we have to be part of this whole thing. God is the judge, but we have to end up making determinations about where we think we're at. But I can't do that to you. and make a judgment about where you're at morally.
That's right.
So we're going to talk about the objective moral rightness or wrongness of abortion and get it out of this personal realm of imputing culpability to people.
Yeah, it's a part of the whole ethical tradition of the West is that even though we sometimes don't see them, or if we see them, we don't really feel for a variety of reasons that we can subscribe to them, that there are objective answers, and that the right answer may vary from one situation to the other depending on the situation. Our whole tradition has been to the contrary, that even if we can't always see them or achieve them in practice, there still are objectively right answers.
Right, and we've talked about that in terms of the natural law.
Sure.
In the Catholic tradition, natural law has often been sort of misused. It's become almost a biological understanding. But at its best, the natural law has always claimed that there is an intelligible structure in reality put there by the Creator, and that the human mind is able to understand that intelligible structure.
Or at least to pursue it with a measure of success.
That's
yes.
right, yeah. Not to get it totally in order, but we're able to conform our mind to that objective structure, and that's what we've commonly called truth. And I think there really is something valuable in that Catholic understanding of natural law and this whole debate that we have to hang on to and keep in front of ourselves.
That's right, that's right. And I think that's one of the things that comes out in the quarrel about the role of sex education, for example, in dealing with this whole large area of which abortion is a part. And that is that while no doubt a large part of the business of being morally good is a matter of goodwill and firmness of will, nonetheless, knowledge to begin with is an indispensable foundation, and people are going to be hopelessly muddled, I think, very often when they come to concrete decisions they have to make without having that context of understanding, at least, of what values are caught up in it. I'm afraid that very often, as you suggested, as the abortion debate has gone on since Roe versus Wade, that people have been pushed to one extreme or the other, and they become single aspect of single issue people, which is, I think, profoundly unhealthy.
Let's try to follow up on that, Bob, and one of the things we would want to try to identify in the whole thing is what is the core issue. Now, it looks to me like you've got two different ideas going here. On the pro-choice side, the core issue is seen as one of freedom and rights. It's as though the people have a great sense of the Enlightenment tradition, that gradually we've moved along and said we have to ensure people have their rights, and we got to make sure that people are not discriminated against, and so on. And here we have women in our society who are often put down or second class. They're the ones who carry the pregnancy. And so the debate is framed in terms of the woman's right vis-a-vis the state, which is going to come in and invade her privacy. I think that is the way the pro-choice people, when they try to work it out, that's how they frame the debate. As someone has said, it's a two-party debate. It's the state and the pregnant woman. And, of course, in that debate, what they want to do is come down on the side of saying, well, the pregnant woman has rights. You don't want the state interfering in all of that. On the other hand, it seems to me the pro-life position sees the equation, the moral equation, in broader terms. It says it's not just the woman and the state. What you've got is the rights of women, value of their, and you got have a lot of empathy for them, and they're the ones who are carrying the child and are open to social ridicule and problems and so on. But then you also must factor in the rights of the fetal life. The fetus has rights as well. And then you ought to think about the rights of the father. He ought to be in the moral equation. And then there's the general broad concerns of the society as a whole that have to be factored in. So it seems to me the Catholic contribution to all of this debate is to say that the framing of the question simply in terms of state and women's right to privacy is too narrow a way to frame it. That we have to frame the question in terms of these larger issues and the rights of the fetus, the mother, the father, and the concerns of the state as a whole. And that's where you really get your difference. What is the core issue? And how do you frame the question? And I think it's good, at least in my mind, to clarify that. I find that helpful to keep in mind. That's why we keep coming up with different answers. We get different answers because the question is different. So we got to somehow begin to talk about what's the proper way to frame the question.
Oh yes, and the answer is going to depend a lot on the way the question is framed. I think that's true. Catholic social thought in its development in modern times in Europe, has always stressed the idea that there are between the individual person and the state a variety of other social structures, that the state itself is not all-encompassing, but rather there are, quite independently of the state, other structures within society, and those structures represent for each of us a whole complex both of expectations that we have of others and of responsibilities that we have toward others. That there are other people beside the state that can come and ask us why we have done what we have done, and there are other people besides the state to whom we should perfectly rightly go for help when we need something in return.
We should keep that traditional Catholic distinction in mind between the state and society, don't you think? You're a great teacher and our mentor, or John Courtney Murray, I don't know if I used the right word there, but a person I know you have great respect for, drew that distinction out of the long Catholic tradition, and I find it to be helpful very often. To say society is not the same as saying state.
That's right.
We say state, we think government. When we think society, we think the whole social body, and with its many actors and its many various communities.
Sure. And yeah, that's a tremendously important decision, because most of the really important things in our life are in the area of society that is not covered by the state. The state is one segment of a large pie, but you think of the family, you think of the neighborhood, you think of the local community, you think of the economic communities to which we belong. A whole variety of things have a great deal to do with the quality of our lives. But I think we're moving a little bit away perhaps from the abortion issue when we talk about that. It is simply, I think, to get back to that point, that on the one hand, the legitimate claim of the individual to be free of interference by the state or by others must be balanced by the consideration of the legitimate claims that we human beings have upon one another. Yes, by all means.
I think that one way of saying it is that the pro-life people, and I think what I consider to be the general Catholic position says that fetal life must be brought within the pale of those who are protected by the law. Mm-hmm. That they must be seen as members of the human community, and that is the core issue. Is fetal life, the nascent human life, to be protected by the law, and is someone going to speak for the unborn life, or are we going to set them aside as not being governed by the general laws of respect for life? Mm-hmm. And I think that is the sort of the thrust of what we're trying to accomplish, I think, within the Catholic community, is get them included in the moral equation. Don't simply rule them out.
Yes, I think to many pro-lifers it seems that the people who are pro-choice, to use those shorthand terms, simply are not willing to take into account that there is any other consideration beside the consideration that the woman herself may want to take.
Bob, here's another thing that we might keep in mind here about if we're going to have a civil debate and eventually solve this whole vexing problem of abortion, is that McCormick suggests that we try to be open and be self-critical about our own positions, that we are willing to admit difficulties and weaknesses in our own position as we try to argue it. And I think that's always a good rule for dialogue. We need to be self-critical so we don't just come across as having all the answers and not being able to improve. He says, he gives some example. He says, some people would simply say that one group cannot impose their views on another group in the society. Mm-hmm. And he says that the problem with just that simple position is that, but what if the other group thinks that what's happening really is the killing of human life? Then then the position becomes more complex. You can't say to them, well, just, let us do it, and you don't have to have abortions if you don't want to. That's your private business. But it's too simplistic in a way. It misses the bite of why we've got this strong pro-life movement, because the people in the pro-life movement say, no, we're dealing with nascent human life, at very least potential human life here, and we just can't set aside and say, okay, go ahead and do that. We feel a responsibility to try to protect the unborn life.
Mm-hmm. Well, sure. I think one of the things that often has to be considered is that Christianity has for a long time said that robbing banks, for example, is bad, but that doesn't mean that when we seek laws that keep our deposits in the bank safe from the bank robber, the yag who's going to blow the safe, that we're somehow trying to impose our morality upon potential bank robbers.
He takes up the other side, Bob, and I don't know, maybe you can help me sort this out. He says something like this, that the argument that the fetus is inviolable from the moment of conception seems to run into certain problems when you start thinking of the pre-implantation stage. That there's a large number of spontaneous abortions that occur during this period. And he says that should at least raise some questions about the absolute character of this principle, of the inviolable character of life from the moment of conception. So, in other words, I know that there's some theologians who want to say there's something different about the pre-implantation stage than after implantation has occurred.
I think there's no question that the scientists are going to have to be able to tell us a great deal more about the physiology, say the development of a neural system, before we can begin to come up with some kind of satisfactory alternative. It seems to me that the people who talk about life beginning at the moment of conception are in fact talking about the safe side of an issue where we can't point to a particular thing. But we do know, for example, that twinning sometimes occurs before implantation or nidation and then disappears spontaneously. So that have you had two persons, then you get back to one, what happens? And it doesn't seem to fit consistently with that theory at all, and it is obviously a difficulty.
Do you know if twinning occurs always before implantation?
I don't know that. I'm pretty sure it always does. Yeah. I think.
Right. In other words, that you're still dealing with that period.
That's right. That's right. Because it's at a very early stage of mitosis that happens or doesn't happen.
So the point that McCormick was trying to make there, I think, is that we should be self-critical and careful and precise in our argumentations as we're trying to make our point. And a lot of the argumentation you hear simply doesn't respect that.
And keeping part the questions we have to ask the scientist, the questions of the ethician, the questions we ask the lawyer, and so on, because all of these people have contributions to make to the public dialogue.
Yeah, that's very true. Okay, we've been trying to look at the Webster case, Bob, and we see that it's going to spawn a new debate now, and what we're trying to do is figure out how to carry on that debate in a productive way so we can eventually get to some sort of consensus that will ground an effective public policy. And I think if we really are going to do that, then we have to make some distinctions here and try to talk more objectively about right and wrong. We're going to have to try to identify what the core issue is and how to frame the debate. Now, to all we said, that seems most important to me. Is the debate really just state versus woman's privacy, or is the debate really about women's rights, fetal rights, father's rights, and the concerns of society? I think it's that larger picture that we really need to focus on here, and I think that will improve the debate.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talked with Father Robert Kirchner, a priest from St. Clement's Parish in Toledo, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections was the abortion debate, identifying the core issues. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.